Hello there and welcome back to our Orlando time-lapse series. In today's episode we will finally finish this side of the main street so that we can start in the next episode with the opposing side of the main street. A quick note just here on the beginning of this episode. I very much recommend that you watch until the last third of this video because I planned something special there that might completely change the performance side of this game and also of its prequel. Therefore I will not only talk about that in depth there, but also show some footage of the prequel and also the sequel of some very important settings and tools that you can use in order to improve the performance drastically. So stick around there. But let's get on with today's episode. So as I always say, the first thing that we have to establish is a degree of enclosement and coherent immersiveness where your buildings that you have aren't hollow anymore. When you look on it, you don't have this initial impression, oh, it's just a facade and in behind you don't have there any structure. It's just very unrealistic then. And so the first courtyard that we built here is located between the Chamber of Commerce building and the City Hall. And within this courtyard you have there a pavilion structure that is used, for example, during Easter for like a little event where you have there some entertainers that wear rabbit costumes. And overall I just find this little courtyard very charming, and you have also lots of foliage and flowers there, and it just glorifies this Victorian style again. So when I was building, I searched also for reference images as usual, and so sadly we have here another area that is not well documented. There are only a few pictures, mainly from Eastern, where, as I said, you have there like this meetup. And when something like that happens, I usually just improvise at this point and follow along the logic of this reference. So for example, the flower beds, I just assumed that they continue also on the wall to the right and left of this courtyard. And at the end of the day, I think this is absolutely in the realm of what is possible and reasonable. I mean, if the public didn't really bother about providing any images here, then there has to be a reason for that. Probably the biggest reason here on this courtyard is just the fact that this area is very hideous. You don't really see it when you walk past by. Or let's say you see it, but you don't have now the intention to go there. And this gets even multiplied by the elevation difference, since you have to take some steps to get there. And also both buildings on the side are grabbing also the whole attention. And so maybe this is the reason why we don't have more images here. I don't know. But it's interesting, right? It already tells you which areas are much more popular than other ones, just when you look on the sheer amount of images there are or the lack thereof. And so if I take the same analogy here to my park that I recreate here in this video game, it would be pretty interesting to compare that to what we would see in real life. So if you check out this park in the future for the first time, where would you go first within this game? Would you take the same steps like in reality, where you would maybe head first to a certain attraction? Or would you completely differ from your normal routine when you would enter this park by checking the backlot or looking on some places where you never been before? And of course you have the biggest difference to reality, that you have this God mode. You aren't bound to anybody anymore. You can just fly in this God mode perspective over the park and swap from Main Street to Tomorrowland in like a blink of a second. And also you can ride any ride there is without having to wait in the queue. And you also experience for the first time maybe this park without any guests in it. In reality, you have the exact opposite. You barely have any photographs or footage where the park is completely empty. And so when you see this park fully empty within this video game, so when I take Anaheim for example, it has a complete different feel to it, and it might even scare you a little bit just because it's so empty and it's almost like a ghost town. And for example, in architecture, this is a common expression method of how you create or present a certain building within a rendering or image or a picture that you show. You can create a certain atmosphere with that and a certain feel that is attached to your building if you leave out people. And by doing that, you also lose the sense of scale. Always when you have some people in your picture, you already know how big or how small a building is, and you lose that if you take that away. I mean, something like this, how you express or present now this park, comes much more later on. But I think it's already pretty good to make some thoughts about that. For example, in Anaheim, I had display sequencers, and in those display sequencers you could attach camera presets. So you could have 25 camera presets within one display sequencer, and in the end I had like 7 display sequencers for each area in the park. So I can very well see that same method also here if they bring back those camera presets to the display sequencer. Just a quick note to that, the best feature that we would need for any content creator, I'm sure, would be just a camera tool where you can place a camera within your park and animate it also, so that you can maybe draw a line and your camera moves on that, and of course it's invisible. In the prequel and maybe also here, you could kinda trick that with the Omni Mover ride, where you can also set specific angles and the speed of it, but then you have this ride within your park, and I don't want all the time to hide that under the ground and bring it back up again. It's just not consistent. So I think there are still many improvements that are lacking in the term when you want to really present your park in the end and to show it off. And also maybe for the workshop, since I only saw that you can upload your park there or your blueprint or something, and you have then there some still images and still frames. I think it would be much cooler if you could like make a little GIF or a little movie within the game itself that you could upload there, and maybe you use those in-game camera presets for that. I think you could see so much more of that and could make the workshop much more interesting also with that method. But I mean, those are just small improvements that would help content creators especially create much more immersive footage for you as you're watching. I mean, as I said, if you want to create an immersive camera movement through your park, you have to place down a ride and completely modify it to your desire. And at some point you have to be very comfortable with some video editing software. I use Adobe Premiere Pro for that, but I'm nowhere an expert within that. I always learn something new every day, almost. And so it would be just great if there are some features within the game where you can quick and easy present your park. And this would perfectly work also with those billboards. I mean, imagine if you have an in-game camera tool where you can render out your little camera movement, then you could in the same time show it also on the billboards. So maybe you can create some pretty epic scenes there where you can advertise a certain ride. Or maybe you make a top-down view on your park and use that as like a map that you can show in the park itself. I mean, you don't have to always use an image for that, and now use Photoshop and save that, edit it, and I mean, it's so much more time then. I want quick and easy and smart solutions within this game that boost the efficiency and the productivity. That's all I'm asking for. So maybe at this point, let's get back to the build. As you're seeing, we create the rear side of the city hall and also try to make it watertight. Right now, I'm not bothering about any entrances or ladders here or something that would fit within this backlot. As I said, we will cover the backlot much later on when we finish the main street itself. And so here the autopilot is kicking in. It's just trying to get things done to proceed to the next area. But I have to say that when I built now this side of the main street, there were so many spots where I was taken back to the Anaheim park, since the hub layout and also the layout or the positioning of the fire station and the city hall is exactly on the same spot there. And so when I compare those two sets of this main street against each other, I have this impression that the sizing and the sheer scale of the main street in the Orlando park is bigger than in Anaheim. But as I say, it's only an impression by me, because I know the distance between this side and the opposing side is exactly the same in both parks. And I find this quite fascinating that at least the main street, and I mean there are even other areas that share roughly the same measurements, that they are so similar to one another. But as I said, I have still the impression and also the feeling that the scale works differently in Planet Coaster 2. And I don't mean the game feature of scaling something, but just the visual feeling when something is scaled up. And so when I compare that to Planet Coaster 1, there I have the impression that everything is much more compactly and smaller compared to when I see it now here in Orlando. And so I don't know what it actually is, if it's now the visual representation of those games, or the lighting, or just the fact that I'm not that far like in Anaheim. I mean, there you have the relationships between all those buildings. And right now we only have this one side of the main street and the railroad station. So something that I noticed by accident is that when you look behind those three buildings here, you have mostly backlot here in Orlando. In Anaheim you have that also happening, but when you go past 10 meters there, you have already Adventureland there. And so you have Jungle Cruise cruising around there, and you have so many exotic trees of this rainforest appearance. In Orlando, this space between Adventureland and the main street here is much more spaced out. You have a much bigger backlot area between that. And maybe that's one of those reasons why this area just looks overall a little bit more spaced out and everything is not that compactly built. But as I said, it can also be just due to the incompleteness right now, and that with the more buildings we build, this general view on it and the complexity and also the compactness will increase over time. So at this point, let's get back to the build. So you saw me constructing this second courtyard between the fire station and the city hall, and this courtyard works a bit differently than the other courtyard. In the other courtyard you have in front there one colonnade, so an area that is surrounded by columns, and this courtyard is actually surrounded by 4 colonnades. And so you have like this outer ring around it where you can walk upon. But the area in the middle of it, you can't walk there anymore. And so the idea is here to place down foliage there, and where this soil bed is also lowered down a little bit in the elevation. But not only do we have that here, you also have this soil bed at the very side to the buildings, so that those two colonnades that run parallel between those buildings, they actually have on the left and right side those soil beds. And I think it's just another beautiful variation how you can loosen this area a little bit up and where you can introduce some foliage. But it also impacts the roof of that, because those colonnades, they support the roof, and over those soil beds you don't have there any roofs. So it impacts directly also the architecture. And then the architecture impacts the illumination or the lighting of this place. So when the sun is falling down here, you have this natural light strip that illuminates those colonnades under it. And I think this gives a beautiful lighting and in the end a nicely balanced scene when you look on this area. You have the foliage, you have like walkways where you can walk upon, and then you have this contrast between shadowed areas and lit areas. So right here I'm adding the brickwork that is still missing on this wall of the fire station. Right here you can also see that I added those windows that are also on the top and are in the same axis. In addition to that, I combined those windows together so they perform like this vertical window element. And so I think it works beautifully with those colonnades now. Since on the ground floor you have the windows there and where you have them underneath the colonnades, and on the top floor you have them actually now above those colonnades. And I think it's playing with a certain principle here, where you can make a building also much more interesting if you blend something in what I would call the yin-yang principle, or light and shadow, or on and off. So it's about contradictions. You have a climax and an anticlimax. And this principle does not only apply now on scenery or buildings or foliage, it also applies to coasters. And I mean, I said climax and anticlimax. And when you have a balance between that, I think you have a certain harmony in the end that flows through whatever you're trying to create. And so for example, on the soil bed, when I placed now down this foliage, I always try to integrate this principle that when you have there some stone, that I like to place something in relationship to that stone. So maybe a bush or a flower. So it's thinking about, when you place something down, to think about the relationship it gives to other things around it. And in the end, it also just comes down to composition. And I think that's just something that you have to learn and to experience. You have to do that so often that it becomes a second nature of you and you define your own style then. For me, that was when I built Matterhorn in Anaheim. There I learned a lot about composition when you place down foliage within a scene. And so whenever I place down foliage, I think to myself, okay, where could this piece that I'm currently placing down, where could this look the best, or where do I like it the best? Maybe it's more a question about yourself, how you find it fits the best within that scene or whatever it is. And if you don't like it how it looks, then you just undo it and redo this process. I mean, it's a very broad and abstract topic, I think, and every situation where you are building on is very different from another one, and you can't really give a final answer to that. But to break it down in one sentence, I think it's just about finding your own style in the end. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And it's just with everything there is, if you play a musical instrument, or you cook, or maybe you drive car, if you do a certain thing so often, at some point it will become second nature to you and you don't really think about it anymore. So right at this moment, we finished now this side of the main street, and what can I say? I think it turned out pretty beautifully in the end, and there were a lot of initial challenges to make it look like that. When I would have to pick something that might be the hardest here on this side, it would be just guessing the scale and the proportion of it. Since right now we only have the railroad station in the park as a height reference, and every other indicator which would tell me how high a certain area is in relationship to another building, I can only guess that in those satellite images and those reference images. So overall, I'm very pleased with the visual representation of this area. It should not only be accurate, but actually it looks also pretty similar to the real life thing it resembles. So before I start now with the little special that I planned within this episode here at the last third of this video, I would like to take this opportunity to thank every one of you that not only watched today's episode, but especially watched the whole series so far since its beginning in November. And also I'm amazed by all the grateful feedback that I receive under those videos. It's an enormous motivational booster that keeps me going, and it's just great to know that I am not alone. There are many people out there that share the same passion and appreciation about Disney and their theme parks, but also Frontier and their Planet games. And in the end, it's again the beauty of unpredictiveness. We don't know what will happen in the future. All I can say is that I try and will try to create this park in its fullest possible state within this game. And therefore I wanted to talk about an essential puzzle piece to make that whole thing work in the end. So let me take you right now into the park. We have to talk about something. So here we are. I planned for this special to talk about the performance side of the game and to talk about something that might completely change the performance side of not only the sequel but also the prequel of the game tremendously. And so for that purpose I thought it might be a great idea to show now live footage of the park, and everything you see is recorded at 60 FPS. And that's just the thing because on YouTube you are limited to that frame rate. And so on the top left you can see the actual FPS or frame rate I get within this park. And so as I stroll through the park you see there are difference in the frame rate that's shifting a little bit. So right now it's shifting between 90 and 110 FPS on average. In a second I will show you my settings that I use. I use the graphic preset of high, and so I think you get a fairly good fidelity and visual quality when you use that preset. When you have this game on ultra, I think there's barely any improvement from that and the frames will drop a little bit. So just here I go into the settings. You see I have it set on custom, but most of those settings are just from the preset high. And the big thing I want to talk about now is the selection here, where you can switch between DLAA, so temporal anti-aliasing, and NVIDIA DLSS. And so there are two settings that you can make here. I will come to them in a second. But when you activate DLSS here, you can see that the frame rate boosts itself, almost doubles itself, and suddenly we have 160 to 180 FPS in the park, and even when you zoom out, you get 200, 230 FPS. And this is the thing I'm talking about. When you use DLSS, you get a far higher frame rate visually in the game. And you can see it when I'm stroll around now roughly the same route as before. I get now in this area 220 FPS. I mean here at the insane fire station, right? 190, okay. So when you look on more buildings, it gets a little bit dumped down, but it relatively stays within that range. And so at first I totally overlooked this graphics setting, because in other games I'm also used that, of course, but there I wasn't caring too much about the actual performance of the game. I mean, in modern games, it's mostly so optimized that it doesn't really matter if it's now 240 FPS or 300 FPS or 144 FPS. I mean, you can see that change also only if you have a monitor that has a very high refresh rate. So I have right here a monitor that has 240 Hertz, and so I can see that. But you, as you are watching, you probably don't see it because you are bound to 60 FPS from YouTube. And so now I would like to talk about those two settings that you can make here. You have frame generation and super resolution. And so on super resolution, you have to make a choice here between the quality setting of that. So performance, ultra performance, balanced or quality. And then you even have DLAA, which stands for anti-aliasing. And so those terms might be confusing at first, but you have to understand what DLSS actually does. It renders a smaller output of the game and scales this smaller frame of the game up to your monitor's resolution. And it uses AI for that, especially on the RTX cards. And so you have to understand for what you would use that in which use case scenario. And that might be a game that is very GPU intensive. So let's say you have some game there that requires a lot of GPU to run it, like Red Dead Redemption 2, for example. And maybe you get 60 FPS there, but you would like more FPS there. And that's the use case where you would use that the output of the game actually gets rendered in a much smaller scale, and the AI boosts this resolution up to your monitor's resolution. And in theory, you should get a lot more FPS then, because you don't have to render the game at the monitor's resolution. But so far this is only the one side of it. And where it actually becomes interesting also for us here is the frame generation. So what is that even, and how does it work? So in theory, every frame that your graphic card is outputting to the monitor has to be rendered, right? And let's say you have 60 FPS. And what this actually does right now is outputting also a second frame that is just purely generated by AI. So it interpolates between one frame and the next frame, and it inserts another additional frame that is rendered by AI. So in our scenario, when you have like 60 FPS and you activate frame generation now, you should then have 120 FPS. At least that's how I understand this technology. And I might be also wrong here. Please correct me if I do so, but that's at least what I think and also what I tested so far. I mean, we just saw it in the footage that I showed in Planet Coaster 2. It doubled the frame rate, so to say. So within the realm of NVIDIA, since I'm using a GPU of NVIDIA, those cards like the 40 series makes use out of that technology, and it's called DLSS 3. And you might know that NVIDIA released their newest RTX cards of the 50 series in January. And this set of cards use DLSS 4. And you can see it already here on the screen that this technology not only generates one image, but actually 3 images that it fits between one rendered frame and another. So in theory, the frame width should triple or quadruple itself, so to up to 360 FPS. So when I realized this a couple of days ago, I was like, wow, this completely changes everything. At least it should in theory, right? And so that's the point where I'm still not 100% sure in the end. But in theory, when you have now an RTX card of the 50 series, you should get within our park even up to 360 FPS or even more than that. And the thing where it comes down to in the end is, I believe, when you disable frame generation and you see the actual frames that you are getting out of the park solely by itself. And so if you, for example, only get 10 FPS, then the AI has to work a lot harder on guessing what you want, what it actually is that it should represent. I mean, if it's a still frame, then this AI don't have to do much, but if you have a fast-paced movement throughout the park where you have a high-speed coaster or something like that, the AI has a lot more guesswork to do. And that's also the point where you then see some artifacting on happening. But in general, I think you can say the higher the base FPS of the game actually is, then the visual quality of those AI rendered frames will increase. And in the end, I think it just comes down to the AI itself. I mean, it has to make enough run-throughs and time there to actually establish a good enough AI matrix where it figures out how a specific area or something looks like. And so at some point I thought, wait, this technology is actually so great that I could very well use that in Planet Coaster 1 in Anaheim, since I have their severe performance issues, where I get only between 15 to 30 FPS on average. And it's really not that smooth of a gameplay, right? And so I thought, well, I have to get such card, right? And so I know that GPU prices in the last 10 years pretty much are as high as they were never, and especially the prices on Nvidia's cards are especially high, and it goes even there where those cards aren't even available anymore, or only the 5090, which is like, I mean, I recently looked that up and it's like 3,500 euros or something like that. It's absolutely insane. For that price, you should get a full build, high-end PC. Not only a graphics card, come on. But one requirement that Planet Coaster 1 doesn't support, sadly, is just the integration of DLSS. So with my card currently, it would not work, because it doesn't support that. But the new DLSS 4, which is exclusively for RTX 50 series, they support that. You can activate that even for games that doesn't come with native support for DLSS. So there you would have one strong argument to buy one RTX card for this game, solely for this project. So no worry, I didn't bought that yet, but I almost did. And that was just the added requirement that I would also need another mainboard that supports those new RTX cards. And from there on you can pretty much rebuild your entire PC. But it's also just the fact that I want to wait for those prices to drop in the next years. I don't want to spend over $2,000 for that. I mean, a 5070 card would be enough here just for this special feature of this DLSS. And I believe, I mean, it's only a software thing, right? I'm pretty sure that they could actually add that also to the current RTX 40 series. And it's just a thing, maybe a marketing thing, where they want to have another selling point for those new cards. And I was even more suspicious when I searched about all those things I talked about right now when researching. And something that I noticed was that there is a software actually that emulates this technology, and it's called lossless scaling. And so this sweet little software that looks so harmless does actually the same thing and even more than what those RTX cards are doing. It introduces this DLSS technology to any game that you want. And so guess what this actually costs? It's only $689. So suddenly I thought to myself, wait, why would I spend $2,000 or even $3,000 for such RTX card if I just can use this software and test it out right now? And that's exactly what I did. So let me show it. So let me welcome you back to Anaheim. Right now we are here on a random guest and go through this park, through the main street and view it from the guest's perspective. And as you see on the top left, we have around 20 FPS. And I mean, you can feel it. It's a laggy footage and you see this low FPS kicking in. And so what I'm doing right now is alt-tapping to the lossless scaling program and activate this frame generation. And you have a couple of options there on how high this frame generation should apply. So if it's only inserting 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames, 4 frames, even up to 20 frames in the end. So I set it here to x4, which means 4 additional frames that get entered between 2 rendered frames. And so then you press on scale, and within 5 seconds you will see the effect on it in your game. So in theory you should now see a much smoother footage while we are strolling through the park. For me it doesn't look as smooth as I would like it, but it's a bit smoother than previous. And therefore I adjusted now to 10 frames that get inserted, and you will immediately see a much smoother footage. And this is the game changer I'm talking about. And so I'm still not completely sure how this really works, if it's now actually inputting 10 frames by the AI. And I go even more ham here by inputting 20, and at this stage you can see some artifacts on appearing, but I mean it's silk as smooth here, like butter. And so something that you can't see just because you only watch it and don't control the camera, I had a bit of input lag here when I tried to rotate the camera also. So in a second I will disable the frame generation, and then we will just see the footage like it is of the game solely by itself. And I mean you can see this input lag and almost looks like a slideshow, right? But guys, I can tell you how hyped I'm actually are about seeing something like this. Right here I'm reactivating it to 20 frames, and you can see that when I rotate the camera very fastly, you can see artifacts happening on the borders of the frame. So here I'm reducing it back to 10, and I think 10 is a kinda sweet spot between the visual smoothness of the game and the appearance of those artifacts. So as I'm flying through the park and testing out those settings a bit more, I would like to come back to the input lag. So as impressive this might look like, visually you can very well feel an input lag happening, and where it more feels like you are still with those 20 FPS in the game. So it's kinda an optical illusion. But still I would prefer this every time, because you just have this added visual quality there, and you could even say that it's playable now. And for me at least, it's not only that, but also just the fact that I can record pretty much anything here very comfortable. I don't have to go the usual road how I would record something in this game, where I would use a third-party program like Sheet Engine and slow down the game speed of the game itself. And then when I recorded it, I would speed it up again in the video editing software. I mean, that's probably the way most content creators that had a very detailed park would record their park seamlessly. I learned that method of recording in a video of Silverred, where he showed this method very detailed, how you can do that. And I think still this is the preferred method how you would record something very seamlessly like a coaster POV. So as you see, I picked now this carousel because from this perspective you have the park in the background, and it's one of those things which is most performance hungry when you look to the middle of the park, right? And therefore I tested how smooth this carousel still moves around while having the park in the background there. So right here we are doing a test ride of Matterhorn, because I'm in the belief that this technology is especially useful for very fast-paced coaster rides, or pretty much any ride that you want to ride now within this park. I mean, that was the reason why I did those dioramas of Space Mountain and Big Thunder Mountain, so that you can actually enjoyable ride those rides without having those performance struggles that let you down. And so while we riding Matterhorn, I think you can very well see the effect of this technology and its impact in context also to Orlando. I mean, here in Anaheim we have a lot of pieces, no question about that. But in Orlando, I think we will extend that piece count very drastically. And for that, this tool, this technology is so vital. I can't emphasize that enough here. It's a little bit awkward because in the last episode that I recorded, I talked about that the impression of the whole park that it gives to you as you seeing it is much more important than the actual playability. And we start to see now, one episode later on, that you can have both. And I'm so aware, of course, that this technology might not be perfect in the end, but I would take it any day over the week, just because we have finally something where we aren't bound to the pure performance anymore. We have this visual post-processing in the end by artificial intelligence that opens up a whole new gate of how we play a game or how we deal with performance within a game. And the weird thing about that is that this technology initially was invented for games that would primarily run on your GPU very intensively. So games like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption. But Planet Coaster, on the other hand, is a very CPU intensive game, because in the end it goes down to the actual piece count, and since piece count is calculated by your processor, it's mainly affected also by that. I mean, the biggest jump in performance I saw when I upgraded my CPU. But again, I talk about Planet Coaster 1. In Planet Coaster 2, this story might be a bit different here, where it's not solely by the CPU in the end, but it might also be on the GPU. Since I don't know if now the DLSS of the RTX cards have a bigger impact on the actual performance, and where it might be beneficial to have a 5090 instead of a 5070. I don't know. And it's also just so weird because, as you see it right now on the screen, everything of that is produced by this little software, this cute little software that costs only $6.89. I mean, why do I have to spend $2,000 to get pretty much the same? Or on those RTX cards, they give you only 3 images. Here you get even up to 20 frames. You kind of feel a little bit fooled there, right? I mean, at some point I will probably upgrade to RTX 50 series, but it kind of shows you already that we have here now something, and I can't emphasize that enough, that completely changed the performance side, at least for the prequel. On the sequel, I also tested a little bit with this lossless scaling, but there I didn't really saw any impact, just because you get a fairly high FPS just by the game itself. And whenever the FPS might drop, then we have the perfect tool for that. So we have a solution for that, to solve finally this issue that constantly hurts us in the back and where we always have to think about that. We finally can let go of that. So to conclude this topic, I thought it might be a good idea to show off a side-by-side comparison of Big Thunder Mountain between the frame generation on off on the left side and the frame generation on with 10 frames on the right side. Also, I slowed down the footage to 50%, and this makes it much easier to see those single frames and how smooth they are, and it also makes some artifacts visible. Something you will realize at the end of this footage, that within this section of Big Thunder Mountain they are not more in sync, and I don't know what happened there. I think it's just something to do with the ride physics, but I can assure you that I recorded them both with the same settings, and it's just the frame generation that was different. And I think you can very well see here the difference between those two clips, that the left one is of course again a slideshow, and on the right side you have a much smoother movement, although you have some artifacts on happening when you take sharp turns. But again, just keep in mind that the whole park is loaded in. And knowing that fact, I think it's an absolute game changer, and it's so cool that it works. So right here you see the same comparison now in real time, and I would also say that the ride footage in general looks a lot better because it looks so smooth. And since it's now real time, I think those artifacts are a lot less visible than before. So you could even say at that point that it's like an effect when you drive very fast within this roller coaster. And so the conclusion out of that is it completely changes the game, as I said now multiple times, and it opens a whole new terrain on how we can look on this game. In the last episode I talked about the importance of impression over the actual playability of this game. I think this discovery that we now made changed the paradigm even more, that we can finally say now playability is always there, and we can now fully focus on the impression the park gives you when you first see it. With those words I would like to conclude today's episode, and I want to make a final note here to the developer of Lossless Scaling, and it would be great if you also like to load my park here in the game, that you maybe try out this program, since those $6 to $7 are, I think, well invested for such a performance that you will get then, better than to spend like $2,000, right? And I mean, if you did that, then I would be very interested about your opinion and your experience, especially on how your input lag to the game is. I at least will write my system specs down below, so you can compare them to your system and to what you saw now today in this video. So in the next episode we will finally start now on the other side of the main street. And as always, I hope you enjoyed it today. If you did, subscribe, like or comment, join our Discord server, watch my other videos about Anaheim or Orlando, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.